You feel like it's time to ditch the perfection in your life? Welcome to the Parable Podcast. I'm your host, Danielle Zapchenk, and joining me today is preacher, podcaster, and perfection ditcher, Carly Bartlett. Carly shares with us about pushing past her anxiety and stepping into the freedom of God's story.
I just would have never known that 12 years before, when I just was bundled up in anxiety and full of feelings of inadequacy, hearing this call, that then the Lord would invite me to share that very same story in that same place.
Here's my conversation with Carly Bartlett. I am so excited to introduce you to my new friend, Carly Bartlett. Carly is a preacher, a podcaster, and she is also ditching perfection. Carly, welcome to the podcast.
Hi, Danielle. Thanks so much for having me. I'm so glad to be here.
Well, we kind of met through the interwebs, if you will. We both have podcasts. I was able to be on Carly's podcast a couple weeks ago, and so that was super fun. It's always great to kind of have a conversation with another podcaster. We were just we're just talking about the things that we go through, that we walk through. So I saw this on your bio line on Instagram. You are a lover of your family, roller coasters, and guacamole.
Yes. Those are some of my most favorite things in the world. Yes. Okay. My girls and I just went to Chipotle last night and had us some guacamole. It's just the best. But yeah, I love roller coasters. My family and I are definitely big theme park people, especially Disney parks. We just love them. We got to go to Disney World this summer, and my husband and I had just the best time riding the big rides with our oldest daughter, who could ride them all. And she's tall enough now, which was really fun. But then we have a 3-year-old who got to just do all the fun, magical princess meet and greets too. So it was a really fun time.
What is your favorite roller coaster of all time?
Oh my goodness. That is such a hard question. I think Millennium Force at Cedar Point is my favorite. I rode that when I was in high school with my family growing up. My dad was the guy who would watch the Travel Channel and write down all of the roller coasters in like the top 10 lists. And we would go to them. My parents were school teachers, and so we had lots of time in the summer to travel. So we just tried to hit the roller coaster bucket list, but that one is incredibly memorable. Have you been to Cedar Point?
I have been to Cedar Point. I did go on that. And I remember, I feel like it was just so high, like the clouds were really low. That day you couldn't even see the top. It was a fantastic roller coaster. I completely agree with you. It was great. Yes. I would ask though, like as you get older, are roller coasters harder for you? Like, do you feel like any motion sickness? Because I love roller coasters as well, but I can feel myself getting like woozy afterwards. I'm like, what is happening?
I don't know that I necessarily have gotten woozy. My sweet husband does though, but I feel like what I'm feeling is my back will hurt afterwards. I'm like, oh, that crinked my back. I can't do the rickety like wooden ones anymore really, because it's just too rough on my back. I feel so old.
And I will still do it. I will for sure still do it.
Yeah.
And maybe now that I'm thinking about it, maybe I should take Dramamine because I love it. I love it so much. And I really want our kids to experience that. They love roller coasters as well. All right. Guacamole. I have a special ingredient for my guacamole. Do you have anything special you put in yours? Or you're just like, I just go to Chipotle?
Yeah, most of the time, to be honest, I don't make it at home. I'm not the best at all that, but I do love lots and lots of lime. So wherever I go, if I can add some lime or have lime on my Mexican food, I love that. What's your secret ingredient though?
Well, I shouldn't say it's just for me because Brie McCoy, she's on Instagram. She's a fabulous cook. She puts like a little hint of cumin in it and also like orange juice in mix with the lime. And it's fantastic. I love making guacamole as well. And so you would have loved this. One time I had a small group over and I just said, everybody bring an appetizer. And it's only a few couples. It wasn't a big deal. But everyone brought a different version of guacamole just out of randomness. It was so funny. You would have loved that night.
It's like a taste test, like instead of a chili cook-off, it's like a guacamole off, but whatever you would call it. Yes, that's awesome.
Well, Carly, you and your husband have 2 girls. I'd love for you to kind of share what's the hardest thing about being a parent this season and what is something that you are just really loving right now?
I think the hardest thing is figuring out how to combat mom guilt. I wear lots of hats. I'm a pastor. I travel and preach. I'm the podcast. I'm a writer. I teach some adjunct classes at a local university in public speaking. And I love all the things that I get to do, but each week is really different. I work very different hours. Sometimes I'm working late at night, I mean, it's just kind of, on one hand, it's wonderful because I love that it's different and I love the flexibility, but also trying to find a good balance for my kids can be tough, especially when I work from home. My kids are with my husband sometimes, some afternoons, and I'm finishing up work and they're like, why can't mom come and play the game with us too? And that, it just pulls on my heartstrings. It's so difficult. But I've had some really wise people in my life say to me, Carly, you are also following God's call in your life. You are modeling what it looks like to be obedient to the Lord, to find joy in work, to work hard, and also show those girls that they can pursue whatever God puts on their heart. And so I've tried to then frame those conversations with my kids to say, I really wish I could have played Monopoly Junior with you guys after school, but guess what I was working on? And I'm so excited about how I got to share Jesus with these people through my writing today. And so I'm excited that you're a part of that too, that this is our family's yes together. And whatever God calls you to, it will be so wonderful too. And so just trying to reframe that, because I think the voice of shame and guilt can be really loud, but also if we can try to tune into the voice of God and the voice of seeing the good in it rather than just seeing how maybe this could be bad or whatever, I think that has helped me shift how I have those conversations with myself and with my kids. But also, it's a balance. I don't want to be a workaholic. I don't want to be not able to say no. And so you asked about something that's been a gift in this season. And for us, as soon as our oldest daughter was born, we realized what the gift of Sabbath was and the invitation was. We had never really Sabbathed before diligently, but I'll say that we now do, and we have for the last 8 years, Sabbathed very consistently every Saturday. And those Sabbath Saturdays are the best. And we Sabbath on Saturday because I work on Sundays, I'm a pastor. But my kids every week are okay, how many more days till Sabbath Saturday? What are we going to do? And we, try to disconnect from our phones as much as we can. We try to set them aside so we're as fully present as possible. We don't work. We don't do things that don't feel life-giving. And so we go to the park with our kids, or we sleep in and we have a pajama party and have pancakes. And it has just been such a gift. And then that also just helps me be intentional then throughout the week to find those moments of stepping away from technology, from closing my computer and being present. But I do think that intentional Saturday is something that we all just realize is such a gift from the Lord.
Thanks for kind of going through what Sabbath looks like for you, because I think some people think are you just supposed to sit there for the whole day?
Yeah.
So kind of describing what that looks like, and that can be different for everyone. And so I love that. You have a podcast, Ditching Perfection. How did that come to be? How did that theme become prevalent in your life that you're I want to make a podcast about this?
So I have struggled with perfectionism since I can remember. I mean, even as a young kid, I have memories of being so petrified that I got something dirty in the back of my parents' car from my muddy shoes. And my mom and dad were oh, Carly, it's not a big deal. And I'm no, just so concerned about making mistakes or making a mess. And my sweet parents, they were always so gracious, but there was just something internal in me that had a hard time with not getting everything exactly right and checking off all the boxes. So, perfectionism is one of those things that disguises itself as actually something really good. We care about excellence and we care about doing things well and always going the extra mile. And while those things are good, there is a tipping point where it becomes unhealthy, but it disguises itself as actually admirable. And our society pats people on the back for overworking and for overachieving and all of those things. And so for me, it was just a pattern, and I didn't really realize just how exhausting it was until several years ago, I realized how much I had been struggling with anxiety that was really rooted in that perfectionism and fear of failure. And so as I went to therapy and met with counselors and friends and family and talked through all of this and really started walking my road of healing and peeling back some of those layers, the conversations that I was having was like, oh my gosh, I am not alone. There are a lot of us that struggle with perfectionism. And in this world that we live in with Instagram and the filters and Pinterest and trying to have our kids' birthday parties like the best that we can. So it's like Instagrammable. I mean, there's so much pressure for us to have it all together that I realize that there are conversations that need to be had in an online community where friends can come together and have conversations about what it looks like to pursue wholeness in Jesus rather than trying to have it all together. Yeah. Because I think when we have the goal of trying to have it all together, we're wrapping ourselves up in webs of anxiety. But when we can pursue wholeness, that is a completely different path. Yeah. And it's an invitation from the Lord. Like perfectionism says we have to do it all by ourselves. And wholeness says this kind of wholeness comes from a posture of rest and responding to God's invitation of grace. So it's just been a really sweet season of having amazing conversations with people like you, Danielle, and many other friends that have shared what perfectionism looks like in their own life and people pleasing and fear of failure, all those things. And I think through talking through it, we really, our vulnerability then helps bring freedom for other people. So it's been a gift to have this journey online.
It is a gift, Carly. I'm super glad that I found it. And just hearing those stories, it's where it connects us, where we're like, oh, I'm not alone in this. There is like some awareness and honesty and vulnerability that takes place. And you realize, okay, I can do that too, or I can see that in myself. So I love that. You are a pastor. And so I'd love to know, like, as a little girl where you're like, gosh, I want to be a pastor when I grow up? Or was that something that God put on your heart later?
So this was something I never expected, to be honest with you. My dream was to be a news anchor. I always grew up watching the Today Show in the morning with my mom. And so I wanted to be like Katie Couric. And I wrote all of my school reports on like famous people or careers on Katie Couric and news anchoring. That's totally what I wanted to do, be in journalism and broadcasting. So when I went to college, I studied communication. And then I got my master's degree in business, thinking I would go that route of marketing, public relations, that kind of thing. But this is part of my parable story. So maybe should I just jump right into it?
Yeah, go ahead for sure.
Yeah, I just was kind of walking this different road after college and finishing my MBA. And Mike and I were early married, but we didn't have our kids yet. And I was working at the university where I went to school. I was doing recruiting for them and loved it, but I just wasn't sure what that next step was going to be like for me and where God was leading. I thought it was in the business realm. And I went to an event. I'm part of the Church of the Nazarene, and I went to an event called Nazarene Youth Conference. And I went to recruit students to our university. I was in my mid-20s, just there thinking I was working all week. And I went to one of the sessions, and there's, 10,000 students there. And I went to one of the sessions, just sat in the nosebleed section. And there was one woman that was preaching that week. And her name is Brooklyn Lindsay. She was a friend of mine. She's a pastor. And she was preaching, and I was just psyched, like, hype girl in the nosebleed section, I'm like, yes, there's a woman pastor. This is awesome. All these young girls get to see her as a role model, dream differently for their futures about being a leader. And all these young guys can see that women can be strong leaders too. I mean, I was psyched. And then totally out of nowhere, I feel like the Lord said, Carly, this call to preach is not just for Brooklyn. This is for you. And I'm like, what? I mean, really, I was like, am I intercepting someone else's message? I mean, I was shocked. It felt like very out of left field. And so I called my husband. I'm like, okay, this is what I am sensing from the Lord. And he's like, all right, let's do it. Like, if this is what God wants you to do, yes, yes, yes. But it was scary for me because of a lot of that perfectionism, where I thought, well, can I do this? Am I adequate? Am I capable? I wasn't a ministry major in my undergrad. What, me? I've never even preached, and now I'm being called to be a preacher? What? I mean, it was just there was so much anxiety wrapped up in all of that I really wanted to say yes to the Lord, but I was kind of paralyzed with fear. But I knew, I think in my gut, like at my gut level, that this was really the Lord, and I would follow what God was inviting me into, and that his invitation was good. But I had to peel back all the layers of that anxiety and perfectionism. And so we took a whole year. We took a whole year to pray. We sought out wise counsel. I was in counseling at the time for anxiety, but we talked to many friends in our community here about ministry, about next steps. And really after that year, it just felt like the Lord really affirmed, like I had a lot of peace moving forward. The anxiety wasn't gone, still had that, but I was in the process of restoration there as well. Still am, but finding more freedom and peace, and just felt like, okay, this is not about me and my capability or trying to have everything under control. This is about God's gracious invitation to me to be a part of what God is doing in the world. The weight of this is not on my shoulders. Like I get to partner with what God is already doing. And that was just an amazing way to shift my thinking. And I'm still trying to figure out how to do that well and not let heaviness of taking on too much responsibility, the perfectionism, all of that. I have to keep that in check because I can easily get anxious, feeling like, oh, am I really able to do this well, Lord? Did I do okay? But just that reminder that, oh, God is so gracious and invites us to things that God will equip us to do. Long story short, but I would have never, ever thought that I would be in this role. And now I can never imagine myself doing anything different.
Carly, we are almost the same person here. I went to communications, that was my degree. I didn't necessarily have a moment where I knew I wanted to speak, but to have like somebody say to you, like, I would love for you to like speak at church. I'm like, what? Me? Are you sure? Like there was like the questions, and it was like really an internal struggle. So I totally resonate with that. When you say like partner with God, what does that look like for you? Or what does that look like maybe for others?
Well, I think, kind of thinking back with the story that I just shared, there's always something that we have to come to partnering with God from a posture of rest and curiosity and asking the Lord, like, what are you already doing? And listening well. But then there's also, there's like the rest and the reliance, but then there's the action. I think there's a both and. We can't partner with God when we're like sitting in our lazy boy, like eating Doritos and just like, okay, Lord, you're just going to like plop this thing in my lap. I mean, sometimes God might do that, but there is a both and of rest and action. And so for me, that was, okay, Lord, I want to partner with what you're doing. I don't really understand what this looks like. So I'm going to take this time and pray and seek counsel. But when I also felt like I really felt affirmed that this is the path that God had, then I also went back to school. That I felt like, okay, if I'm going to do this, I want to be equipped and I want to receive education so that I want to be a credible theological voice and all of those things. So I went back to school and I got my MDiv and things like that. Like I've just constantly been asking the Lord, and even now, even in my pastoral role, and it's a daily thing in my family life. Okay, Lord, what are you doing and how can I partner with you? I like to talk. I love to talk. That's just my thing. But the Lord also teaches me to listen. And when I listen to the voices of others in my community, when I listen to the voices of the people in a church setting when they've invited me to come and speak, instead of me coming and going, okay, here's my story, here's what I want to share. Before I do that, I just really feel like the Lord says, listen first, because then I'm already at work. Like I just have this great belief that God has a prevenient grace that like goes before us, and God is already at work, like already pursuing hearts, already writing stories of restoration. And so I want to see what God is doing. So I want to listen, like, hey, what is happening in this community? Hey, what's going on in your world right now? Listening to people on the margins, I think is just so important too, because God is always at work in the most unexpected places and the most unexpected people. So if I can listen and absorb and be like a sponge, then I can like see these God fingerprints everywhere. And then I can go, okay, so now what's my role in this, Lord? And it helps me realize that it's not all about me. And not that I want it to be all about me, but sometimes perfectionism says you are highly responsible to make sure this such and such thing happens. But when I'm partnering with God, it changes it to say, what's my role to play in what you're already doing? And I think that has just been so significant. So carving out time to listen to God, listen to others, and especially listen to people on the margins has been significant in my story.
What a good reminder. Listening is super important, I think, for any relationship. There was a conversation I was having the other day with a lady, and she was saying, she was nervous about an upcoming interview. And she's like, even a fearful yes is still a yes. And so you had talked about anxiety and God, like kind of just saying, like, this is the role I want you to be going in for preaching. Talk to me a little bit about like the fear, the anxiety of like, is this the right place? How did you kind of work through those emotions?
I think I grew up with this idea, and I don't know even where I got this necessarily, but I had this idea that God's plan was like very narrow. Like if you miss this step and you choose the wrong college, then boom, you're out of God's will. And I think there are many of us that have felt that way, that we put so much pressure on ourselves to make these right decisions because we are living in so much fear of totally missing and walking a different path and missing God's plan for us. And I think it helped me in that season and in other decisions that we've made to realize that God, if my heart is in the right spot and so I'm going, Lord, I so want to honor you with my decisions. If I make a decision, God's not going to be like, oh, you tried so hard, you missed it. That's too bad. You know,
Yeah.
Like the Lord is going to be so gracious and being like, oh, you know what? I see that you really are wanting to do it and do what I'm calling you to do. And even if you have a little step over here that wasn't exactly like what I was intending, I'll just realign. And I think about it with my kids too, you know, and I ask them to go and clean their room and they do it. And I walk in and it's not necessarily cleaned in the way that I would do it. Yes. You know how it goes.
I know it.
Yeah. But it's like clean and they did it. They just need maybe a little extra help in fine tuning what that looks like. I'm like so delighted that they did it, you know, and I'm so delighted that they tried and that they wanted to do what I asked them to do. And so I think that's what God does for us. And so it's helped me shift from thinking that there's so much pressure on like just the hopscotch game of life. Like, okay, step 1, then you have to jump in step 3, then step 6, and you can't miss, to go, no, I think it's a lot wider than that. That God is just like, I have equipped you. I have given you passions and abilities and things that delight you and talents. And now go do good with it. So for me, I felt pretty clearly that the Lord was saying, go do good with it in the ways that you preach. But for other people listening, they may be going, I don't know what God wants me to do. And I'm petrified to make the wrong decision. And so if you don't have a clear call right now or clear call ever, then however God has wired you, go and do good with it. Find joy in what you do because God's wired you exactly the way you're supposed to be wired, and you will be glorifying God and delighting the heart of God. I think sometimes our calls are really specific and other times I don't. Maybe there's seasons where they're not, and that doesn't mean we're missing God's will.
And like you said, like God is God. So he can adjust and move things as necessary. So he's not like, oh, well, there she goes. She messed up again. I don't believe that that's his heart or true character. Carly, what would you say? You had talked about having freedom and a sense of peace. And once you stepped into that role of being a pastor, was there something that stood out to you that you're like, this is exactly what I'm supposed to be doing? This is like, there was this one moment.
Yes. I feel like the Lord has been so gracious to give me such joy as I have preached all these years. I've been preaching now since 2011. So many times. Like I love to preach. It is like one of the most joyful things of my life. In addition to hanging out with my kids and my husband, going on roller coasters, preaching and eating guacamole. Those are like my favorite things of life. And I find that the Lord just affirms me over and over in the joy that I have when I get to preach. And I just love that God invites us to things that will bring us joy. That God, I don't think, calls us to things that are like a ball and chain that are going to be drudgery. Maybe sometimes for a season, you know, maybe. But in the long run, God wants us to be delighted and use the things that he's given us to glorify him and to bring us life and joy. And so one of those defining moments, though, I'll tell you, actually happened just this last summer, this past July. I was invited to speak at Nazarene Youth Conference, the same event where I felt my call to ministry 12 years ago, where I sat in the nosebleed section, wondering if I was hearing clearly from the Lord. This summer, I had the opportunity to preach at that same event. Wow. And be there on that same platform and get to share my story with 10,000 students. Oh my word, Danielle, I was like so overwhelmed with emotion the whole week we were there. And my friend Brooklyn, who had preached 12 years ago, she came and was there sitting with my kids. It was just this full circle moment. My husband is an artist and he painted during the session when I preached and painted these images that connected with the sermon. And I just sobbed most of the week out of gratitude because I just thought, Lord, you write the best stories. I just would have never known that 12 years before, when I just was bundled up in anxiety and full of feelings of inadequacy, hearing this call, that then the Lord would invite me to share that very same story in that same place. And it was just so incredible then we were able to be there the whole week and have students come talk to me about their own anxiety journey, or girls coming and saying, I have a call to ministry, but I've never seen a woman preach before. Yes. And I didn't know how to imagine my future until I saw how you are living your obedience to God. And oh my word, like it's all God. It's just all God. And then that brings even more joy too, to say, thank you, Lord. Like I could have never written this story. What a gift. What a gift it is to say yes to Jesus.
When you hear that from the girls that come up to you and say, I've never seen a woman pastor, never seen a woman preach before. There's a lot of women out there that have this desire in their heart, but maybe either their circumstances, the church that they're a part of, their denomination doesn't let them do that, doesn't allow for that at this time. What would be your encouragement to them?
That is a good question. I am really thankful for the faith community that I have been raised in. Like I said, I'm in the Church of the Nazarene, and the Church of the Nazarene has actually been ordaining women since before women could vote. So long tradition of empowering women, which has been such a gift. And so I personally have been able to see women preachers and been able to learn from seminary professors who were women, and just so grateful. But I know that that's not everybody's story. And I know, even being involved in Women Speakers Collective Boot Camp, where I know you were involved in one of those too, just talking with many women that are saying, this is not the context. Like I feel this call, but the context that I've been in, or even my own family, doesn't support my call. Yeah. That's really, really heavy. So I don't have a great quick answer, because every situation is so dynamic and complicated in its own ways. But I would just say, for people who feel like their voices are being stifled, there are communities that won't stifle your voice. And if you really feel like God has called you to be a teacher, preacher, leader, and you don't have a place at the table, there are places that would love to have you at their table. So find and connect with people. I would be more than happy to chat with and connect with anyone that just needs someone in their corner to help them process how to step into the leadership they feel like God is inviting them into. I feel like just biblically, I've done a lot of research because I've had pushback from people.
What?
Yes. So, I've done a lot of research on those very difficult passages that people often bring up, why women should be silent in the church. And, if anyone ever wants to unpack that, I actually in my MDiv program wrote a pretty substantial research paper on that. Not that we want to argue with people, but sometimes it is helpful to say, oh my goodness, okay, wait, Paul, even though he said this in this one context to this one community, he also had Phoebe, who he talks about in Romans 16, who was a deacon of the church. She was a pastor. He sent her to go and share the letter to the Romans, which was so theologically deep. Oh my word, Romans is so intense. And she was entrusted to go be the teacher of that to that community. And so there's just things that when we start really peeling things back, that I think we can see, at least from my perspective, and I know there are others that see things differently, and that's okay. But I feel like the Lord empowers both men and women to be preachers of the good news. And if anyone listening feels that, and you're being stifled somewhere, another community, another church, another set of friends will say, yes, how can we support you, instead of how can we keep you quiet?
That's so good, Carly. Thank you for that. So when you were in the nosebleed section, Carly, God said, this is for you. How does somebody, even with the lens of the perfectionism, how do they know and decipher and to be able to listen to God's voice clear enough so that they can say, okay, yes, this is my next step?
Such a good question. For me, I really relied on community. I relied on the people that were close to me. I relied on wise counsel, people who have walked through similar roads and seasons. And so, I was so petrified, like I wanted to make sure this was really God. And so I didn't want to make a fast decision. And so I didn't rush into anything, and I sought community and I sought the Lord. And I think that those three things are really helpful in all things that I try to discern. My mom, I remember when I was younger, said that God never calls us to make a rushed decision. God isn't panicky and wanting us to hurry. Like God is so at rest and such there's a settled security with God. So God isn't calling us to make any rush choices. So that's first. I just knew, okay, if this is a huge call, this is a huge change. This is going to change the rest of my life if this is what God wants me to do. So I'm not going to rush. And then second, yes, I talked to people that were close to me. First call, my husband. Second call, my parents and my brother. And they know me well. And so they could say, oh, Carly, we see this in you. Like, this makes sense. And they would remind me of things from my childhood where I loved public speaking and all of that from a young age. I mean, I wanted to be a news anchor, back to that. And now I'm thinking, okay, I'm not going to be telling the news. Like, God is calling me to preach the good news. Some of those like themes, my loved ones could remind me, wait, Carly, you are more equipped for this than you even realize. And then also, we live in a university town here. My husband teaches there. We have an amazing school of theology here. And so I was able to go to some of those friends that teach in the school of theology and say, okay, what do I do? What do I do next? If this is really what God's calling me to, I want to explore it. I want to learn more about what I'm saying yes to. What do I do? And so they helped point me to going to seminary. I went to Nazarene Theological Seminary, and just having people help me know even practical steps, because sometimes the practical steps are just as daunting as some of the other decisions that we have to make along the way. And so for people to give me that kind of insight was helpful too. So I think those things of realizing that we don't have to do things in isolation. And then as I was seeking the Lord and journaling and writing out my feelings and going to counseling, just the intersection of all of that wisdom and me being curious about what God is doing and just asking a lot of questions then helped me have the clarity to move forward in ways that I needed it. But perfectionism tells us that we have to figure everything out on our own. And then we have to have it all figured out. We shouldn't need help. And so there's just in ditching perfection, there's such an importance of being willing to embrace vulnerability. And when we are vulnerable, I feel like that then leads us down the path that God has for us with more clarity and with more peace.
That's so good. Carly, you have very wise, rich words to say. I'm just so grateful to hear all your stories. And I think that is cool. What you brought back to Katie Couric is just that you get to share people's stories now. Yes, it's not exactly the Today Show. But gosh, I mean, it's such like more abundant and more joyous than that could ever be. And again, it's the plan that we're like, I never even imagined this. So thank you so much for sharing today. If people wanted to get connected to you or learn more about your podcast, how can they do that?
Yes, I would love to connect. I'm on Instagram. My Instagram handle is Carly Communicates, and it's CARLY Communicates. And then my website's the same, carlycommunicates.com. And I have a weekly email that I send out with a little devotional. And so if anyone's interested in signing up for my devotional, then they can do that on my website as well.
Well, Carly, thank you so much for helping us just kind of recognize we need to ditch perfection and just really focus and listen to what he says. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me. I really enjoyed our conversation today, Danielle.
Grateful to spend some time with Carly. You can really hear the joy that is behind her when she is talking about the freedom of where God has placed her in her life. To connect with Carly, simply visit daniellezapchenk.com for details. And here are 2 reflection questions from our time with Carly. Number 1, what is one way you can give yourself a little bit more grace this week and choose to ditch perfection? Number 2, spend some time in prayer and see how you can partner with God in whatever decision or next step you have coming your way. One easy way you can support the Parable Podcast is simply by sharing this episode with a friend. If you could pass this along today, that really helps people find out about these amazing parable stories. And thank you to my technical producer of a husband, Eric, for making us sound so fantastic today. That is going to do it. Grateful that you took the time to spend it with me. Remember, your parable showcases how God is with you despite your imperfections. We'll see you back again next week on the Parable Podcast.